The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. On the first day of the week, Mary of Magdala came to the tomb early in the morning while it was still dark, and saw the stone removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and told them, "They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple went out and came to the tomb. They both ran, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and arrived in the tomb first. He bent down and saw the burial clothes there, but did not go in. When Simon Peter arrived after him, he went into the tomb and saw the burial cloths there, and the cloth that had covered his head, not with the burial cloth, but rolled up in a separate place. Then the other disciple also went in, the one who had arrived at the tomb first, and he saw and believed. For they had not yet understood the scriptures that he had to rise from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord. Well, good morning, everyone. If you go into a Greek Orthodox church on Easter Sunday morning, pretty much anywhere around the world, and especially if you're on the mainland of Greece, they have a little ritual that the priests do at the beginning of Mass that to some may seem a little irreverent or, on the other hand, just bizarre. They process into the church with all that incense smoke billowing, and they do use a ton of incense, believe me. And they go in there with all this regal, royal music. They make it up to the altar, and then they do the opening prayer, and then the priests go into the sanctuary and start cracking jokes back and forth to one another. I mean, just jokes back and forth, one right after the other. Now, the whole idea behind that, it's symbolic, actually. And what they're trying to do is to make the impression that Satan thought he was going to put Jesus down forever. And so Jesus was raised from the dead, so ha ha ha, neener, neener, neener to Satan. That's the whole idea behind it. Now, not to be outdone by the Greek priest, I've got my Easter funny story. Once upon a time, there was a cotton farmer. He had a small farm way out in the country down south. And he had fallen behind on his payments, his loan that he got from the bank. So one day, the bank sent this debt collector to go and negotiate with dear Fred. And so he drove out into the country and found Fred's house, and he walked up on the front porch and he banged on the door. Well, Fred's wife just cracked the door open, and she saw this guy very slickly dressed, and she said, "What do you want?" And he says, "Fred home?" And she said, "No, he's gone for cotton." And so the guy said, "Well, I'll come back another time." And so he waited a couple days, and he came back and went up to Fred's property and went up on the front porch, knocked on the door, and she cracked the door open just a little bit, and she said, "What do you want?" And he said, "Is Fred home?" And she said, "No, he's gone for cotton." And so the guy's thinking he's getting the runaround here. So he tells her he'll come back in a couple days. So he does come back in a couple days. And he goes up in the porch and he knocks the door, and she opens up the door, and he says, "Is Fred home?" And she looked and she said, "No, Fred's dead." And he thought, "Oh my goodness, that's terrible." And so he apologized for the disturbance and went on in his car. And more he thought about it, he thought to himself, maybe I'm being bamboozled here. So he decided to drive up to the town cemetery and just take a look and see. And so he did. And he walked around through the cemetery, and he noticed a freshly dug grave. And so he walked up to the grave, and sure enough, there was the name on top of the tombstone, Fred Jones. But an inscription underneath which read, and I quote, "Fred is gone, but not for cotton." Now, they laugh at those Greek priest jokes louder than that. Come on. Well, I do have a not-so-funny story, a powerful story, and one that I found in one of my journals that just spoke volumes about today. In a cemetery in Hanover, Germany, is a grave on which were placed huge slabs of granite and marble, cemented together and fastened with heavy steel clasps. Why? Because it belonged to a woman who vehemently did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. So she directed in her will that her grave be made so secure that if there were a resurrection, it could not reach her. On the marker were inscribed these words: "This burial place must never be opened." But you know, in time, what happened was that an infinitesimally small little seed, covered over by the stones, began to grow. Slowly it pushed its way through the soil and out from beneath them. As it grew and its trunk enlarged, the great slabs were gradually shifted so that the steel clasps were wrenched from their sockets, and there it was. The grave was exposed. A tiny seed had pushed aside those enormous stones. When I read that story, I couldn't help but think how it fits with our gospel today. We have the account from St. John of the Lord after the resurrection, one of the Easter stories. There are 9 of them total in all the 4 gospels. But John, as usual, is a bit different. He opens up his story, we're told, while it is still dark. It's early Easter Sunday morning. And for John, darkness means lack of faith. Not until the first person says, "I believe in Jesus," will the sun come up in John's gospel. But Mary Magdalene and another of the women went to the tomb. They were going to go to anoint the body of Jesus, and guess what? The stone has been rolled back from the tomb. There's no body. They are totally freaked out. And they take off running back to the person who has emerged as the head of the pack at this point, Peter. And she says to Peter, she's beside herself, "They've taken the Lord's body. Somebody stole it. It's not there." And so we're told that Peter and an unnamed disciple, he only appears in John's gospel. He's called simply from the Greek, the one whom Jesus loved. They take off in a foot race almost to go check out Mary Magdalene's story. And as they're running along, it's interesting, the one whom Jesus loved gets ahead of Peter and outruns Peter. That's John's symbolic way of saying he has stronger faith than Peter. And he arrives at the tomb first. And what does he see? Exactly what the women had said. The stone rolled back. And he looks inside the tomb. And what he sees is amazing. The cloths that had covered Jesus' dead body were not only lying there, but they were neatly folded. The cloth that had covered his head was neatly rolled up. What does that say to us? What said? He listened to Mary. He obeyed his mother about make sure your clothes are tidy. Actually, it says something much more profound. But the guy looks in, he sees these cloths, he doesn't go into the tomb, he doesn't have to. He knows what has happened. Peter, clueless Peter, goes inside, he's looking around, and he has the duh experience. What does this mean? What does this mean? Well, the one whom Jesus loved, that beloved disciple, put it all together. And how correct he was. Jesus had been raised from the dead. So what's the deal about the burial cloths neatly folded, very neatly folded? What does that mean? Because only John has that account. Well, there are a lot of things about this passage and other passages of John that we find only in his gospel. For instance, Jesus came to this world in John's Gospel in John 3:16, verse 18, not to condemn the world, but to save the world. And Jesus in John's Gospel is not just some Messiah. He's not just the Son of God. He is literally God Almighty. Only in John's Gospel, in John 1:18 and John 20:28, is Jesus called God Almighty. And we find a picture of Jesus almost like a superhero. Jesus never wavers. He never questions. He never wonders. For instance, in John's Gospel, we have in the other Gospels the picture of Jesus going into the garden and praying in agony. God, if it's possible, let this cup pass me by. It might surprise you that Jesus doesn't go into the garden in John's Gospel. In John 18, verse 11, he's standing outside of the garden when they come to arrest him. Peter pulls out his sword as though he's the big cheese that's going to save this scene. Jesus says, put your sword back into its scabbard. And then he looks at the disciples and says, what am I supposed to say? Father, let this cup pass me by? No. It was for this hour that I came to drink this cup. Jesus is prepared to suffer. He doesn't cry and say, let this pass me by. When it's time to go up to the Calvary carrying the cross, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell us that Jesus is so exhausted. He is in such incredible pain that the Romans forced this guy named Simon of Cyrene to help Jesus carry his cross. It might surprise you. In John's Gospel, there ain't no Simon. Jesus carries the cross by himself. He doesn't need anyone's help. Thank you. And then when Jesus is hanging on the cross, in Mark and Matthew's Gospel, we hear those agonized, pitiful words of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Those words are not in John's Gospel. In John 19:30, as Jesus is preparing to leave this world, he's busy working, making relationships between his mother and this unnamed disciple. And then, when Jesus is ready, and only when he's ready, John tells us, he says, it is finished, and he hands over his spirit. Satan cannot take his life away from him. So you get this picture of this very strong, powerful, victorious Jesus. And so the cross being rolled up neatly and put away, rising from the dead ain't no big deal for Jesus, because he did it for our salvation. Satan, evil, death, nothing can take his control and power away. And so rising from the dead, why not take the time to neatly fold your clothes? You're in charge of this. And it was his choice to do so. Well, what does that say to us? In this life, we who claim to be disciples of the Lord have those times when we are no different than Peter and the other apostles. We deny him, we betray him, we forget about him, and we lose faith in him. And let's face it, things happen in this life that really do shake us up. I know many of us were very disturbed, very shocked with the death of Megan and Carol Crawford and Kelsey Kuhn this past week. 3 young women with years to go in their lives, it would seem, who were tragically had their lives snuffed out by another motorist. Those kind of things do tear at you. They tear at your faith. And if you're not vigilant, it can rob you of what faith you have. But the good news is, just like that little tiny seed that pushed its way through pure concrete and steel, Jesus is strong as well. He will never ever let us fall away for good. He gave his life for our salvation and faith. When we find ourselves weak and fallen down, we need to get back up. In fact, I was thinking this morning about being in a home of a little baby one time. It had just taken its first steps and going into the house, and the parents were elated. And here's this little toddler, trying to struggle with this next set of new steps and falls right straight on his face. First thing he does is look up at Mommy. And her facial expression determined whether he was going to cry or smile. She smiled back at him quite sheepishly, and so did he as well. That's how the Lord is with us. He's like that parent when we're trying to walk the journey of faith, and when we stumble and fall, who's there with the biggest smile on his face, saying, "My son, my daughter, get back up. Let me help you get back up." Jesus does not want us to stay down in the road. He wants us close to his heart. So my brothers and sisters, today is a celebration of power. Jesus conquered sin and death forever. Its effects remain and affect us in this life. But still he's there for us, if only we will surrender our lives and turn it all over to him.